Okay, waiting for folks to come in. At this point, give it about 3 to 5 minutes for folks to come in. Welcome to those of you who are joining us. All right, great. Looking at the numbers go up. It's terrific. Appreciate so many of you turning out on what was certainly a dreary Tuesday here. Hope that your Tuesday was not quite as dreary. Patrick, how was it up in Milwaukee?
Bizarre. We had snow here 5 days ago. Today it ran up to 70. And then later this week it's supposed to snow again. So it's just been up, down, up, down. That's I lived for
Oh my
years in
goodness.
Virginia uh and remember a lot more humidity than I enjoyed. But we didn't have these wild swings of temperature. But
Well,
that's
we're
spring
having
in
them now.
Wisconsin.
We're having them now.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Sadly. I mean, I wanted a proper winter. That didn't happen. Thank you for those of you who are coming in and you're listening to our banter about the weather. Sorry about that. We're going to start in just a few minutes here, maybe another 2 minutes as folks log on.
This is one of the benefits of a virtual presentation is you don't have to venture out into the weather.
Indeed, indeed. Well, and in the Northern Neck, it can be awfully dark at this hour. So don't want to be venturing out on the roads to Stratford Hall where there's lots of wildlife also you'd have to dodge.
Hmm.
Hmm. Okay, so I think we're getting near where we want to be. Make sure I've got all my notes ready. I'm dealing with multiple screens here. So let me begin by welcoming you all tonight. It is so lovely to see so many of you on this Tuesday evening. This is the 258th anniversary of the Leedstown Resolutions. And, if this is the kind of programming from Stratford Hall that interests you and you'd like to lend a hand, please go to stratfordhall.org, click donate, type academic programs or lectures in the comment box with your donation. We'd be most grateful. In terms of Zoom etiquette, I have disabled the chat, but enabled the Q&A where you can place your questions or your comments as we go. My name is Dr. Gordon Blaine Steffey. I am the Director of Research Academic Programs and the Jesse Ball DuPont Memorial Library here at Stratford Hall Historic Preserve. I held an endowed chair in comparative philosophy for 20 years at Randolph College, formerly Randolph-Macon Women's College, before I joined Stratford in 2022. My friend and colleague and dialogue partner tonight, and I'm very grateful to him for being here, is Dr. J. Patrick Mullins, who is the Associate Professor of History at Marquette University in Milwaukee, where he also directs the Public History program. He is the author of The Father of Liberty, Jonathan Mayhew, and the Principles of the American Revolution. He is at work currently on a new book about the cultural origins of the American Revolution that's entitled All True Patriots, Memory of Resistance in the Transatlantic American Revolution.
I may have to shorten that subtitle a little bit.
I was just thinking it could be sexier, but in 2023, Patrick was the first recipient of the Stratford Hall Research Fellowship on Colonial, Revolutionary, and Early National America. He was also in attendance at our September Pitt, Peel, and the Patriots Symposium at Stratford Hall, where he delivered a lovely address on the topic of our painting. Good evening, Patrick, and welcome.
Good evening, Gordon. Thanks for having me. And I'm really grateful to everyone who came out. I'm used to having a captive audience of undergraduates that have no option but to listen to me, but to have people go out of their way out of just a love for history to sign on. I'm really grateful.
Yeah, it's like I said before we got on here, it's a delight to be talking to adults tonight. So I wanted to start this evening by reading just a bit of the Leedstown Resolutions, which we're commemorating here tonight. Striking language, and I hope that I can do it justice. I'll do my best at a dramatic reading. Roused by danger, and alarmed at attempts, foreign and domestic, to reduce the people of this country to a state of abject and detestable slavery by destroying that free and happy condition of government under which they have hitherto lived, we who subscribe this paper have associated and do bind ourselves to each other, to God, and to our country by the firmest ties that religion and virtue can frame, most sacredly and punctually to stand by, and with our lives and fortunes to support, maintain, and defend each other in the observance and execution of these following articles. First, we declare all due allegiance and obedience to our lawful sovereign, George III, and we determine to the utmost of our power to preserve the laws, the peace, and good order of this colony as far as is consistent with the preservation of our constitutional rights and liberty. Secondly, as we know it to be the birthright privilege of every British subject that he cannot be taxed, but by a consent of a parliament in which he is represented by persons chosen by the people, if therefore any person or persons shall attempt to deprive this colony of these fundamental rights, we will immediately regard him or them as the most dangerous enemy of the community, and we will go to any extremity, not only to prevent the success of such attempts, but to stigmatize and punish the offender. We will exert every faculty to prevent the execution of the said Stamp Act in any instance whatsoever within this colony, and every abandoned wretch who shall be so lost by virtue and public good as wickedly to contribute to the introduction or fixture of the Stamp Act in this colony by using stamped paper or by any other means, we will, with the utmost expedition, convince every such profligate that immediate danger and disgrace shall attend their prostitute purpose. Okay, so Patrick, we're going to think together through this document and some of the circumstances surrounding it tonight, the legacy of this document. What stands out to you about it, and what's got them so riled up?
The language is extraordinarily heated and implicit, almost explicit. And the Leedstown Resolves is the threat of armed resistance to the enforcement of the Stamp Act. And that makes this document really extraordinary in the history of colonial resistance to the Stamp Act. I mean, thank goodness that you've devoted so much energy to trying to bring the Lee family and their contributions to the revolution to light, and the Northern Neck generally, because the Leedstown Resolves are not widely acknowledged by historians as being important, and yet I cannot think of any document in the period that that uses this kind of language. Putting, I mean, like, you expect in the Declaration of Independence to hear the signers pledge their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor, but to hear in February 1766 these Virginian planters pledging their lives and fortunes to stopping implementation of the Stamp Act, it's really extraordinary stuff. You noted with the first resolution that they immediately make very clear we are loyal subjects to the king. And this should not be read as any kind of resistance or opposition to the crown. And yet, they are both threatening to punish any abandoned wretch who even says Parliament has the right to tax the colonies. And that last resolution where they've talked about forming an association for the protection of the liberty and property of all of its members, and that they will take action in defense of liberty and property. They're talking like a government within a government. I mean, and this is the first thing that you do hear in 1774. You have legislatures that meet extra constitutionally and in effect speak in the name of the people, but independent of crown authority. That's what the Westmoreland Association does. I mean, at least in terms of that's what its mandate is in the resolutions, in that sixth resolution, which is just extraordinary stuff. So, I mean, what explains the intensity of this response? It's maybe maybe a little bit of a mystery for historians, that the colonies almost universally explode against the Stamp Act, which doesn't seem quite so horrible.
Right, because in many ways it's just kind of the latest indignity, isn't it? I mean,
It
from a
is,
cultural
yeah.
perspective, right? I mean, this is, just yet another thing, right?
And it's not that it's a massive tax either.
Yeah.
When the Prime Minister George Grenville first thinks of it and kind of publicly says we're planning one in April 1764, he pushes a stamp act precisely because he thinks, well, it's so low and so evenly distributed. No one will get upset about this, right? Of course, because it's so evenly distributed, it touches everybody. It's not like the Sugar Act, which hurts certain groups more than others. But it's for the most part, it's not a crushing tax.
Hmm.
Uh, it is the principle of having a tax levied on the colonies that is a direct tax. It's not like a customs duty. You can't avoid it.
Hmm.
It touches every aspect of public life, really.
Right.
You're taxing, you got a penny tax, penny per sheet tax on newspapers. You have like a 2 shilling tax on most contracts.
Right.
There's even, I think, a 10 pound tax on lawyers' licenses.
Yeah.
So
Academic degrees,
your
gaming dice,
diplomas, bills of sale,
playing cards.
dice, cards. So who is most directly affected? Well, let's see. Lawyers, politicians, merchants, students, and oh yes, sailors on leave who play dice and cards. Like so, the most argumentative, the people thinking of college students who have the most free time on their hands to raise trouble, and sailors on leave. I mean, these are the guys that are going to help form mobs up in port cities up and down the colonies. But it does touch to every aspect of public life, uh, uh, and it is opposed. And this is one thing that does make the colonists they respond to British imperial policy by thinking in principle. And
Right.
for them, and this is when Richard Henry Lee is first pushing Virginia to respond to this proposed Stamp Act,
Hmm.
when George Wythe writes the remonstrance on behalf of the House of Burgesses in opposition to the Stamp Act, when Patrick Henry is pushing the Virginia Resolves in May 1765, and then when the other colonies start to come in, they all are opposing this tax in principle. And the principle, of course, we all know it from school, no
Right.
taxation without representation,
Right.
which just sounds like some mantra, but the central idea is that we all have so much to benefit from living together in society and living under government and agreeing to live under law, but only laws to which we've consented. And if you are subject to a law in which you haven't consented, then you're not a citizen, you're not a free person, you're a slave, you're a subject, and the government can do whatever they want to you. So the colonists respond by appealing to this principle. And that's a principle that the British government will never concede. They say from the beginning of this crisis to the end, they will maintain Parliament is sovereign over the colonies. We have the right to make laws binding on you. We have the right to tax you without your consent. And the colonists can't agree to that. And ultimately, the fact that they cannot reach a compromise on these two conflicting principles is what I will not say the revolution is inevitable, but it puts the America and Britain on this collision course.
Yeah.
And we first have an indication that this debate over colonial policy, over a not super oppressive tax, could lead to revolution. One of the first places you see it is in the Leedstown Resolves, with this
Yeah.
kind of appeal to say we're going to we're going to oppose this at every extremity. We're going to put our lives at hazard. I mean, really, this
Well,
is revolutionary
it's great
talk.
because, in 1776, we've got the backing of an army. Here in 1766, no such thing. Just on what you were saying, there's a great letter written by Richard Henry Lee to his crony Landon Carter of Sabine Hall. But one of the things that he says, and this is February 2nd, 1766, and one of the things that he says to Carter, and this is to speak to the point that you just made, Richard says this: Are we really to be enslaved by part of our own community as a grateful return for the benefits they've derived from the danger and enterprise of our fathers? You may judge what profit we can propose to receive from memorials, however fraught with reason or filled with justice, when a gentleman writes me from London in October last, quote, the minister replied passionately, and pardon my English here, God damn them, we will show them that we have power to tax them, and we will tax them. So that's Richard Henry Lee quoting, hearing from a minister friend in London. Here's what another minister's saying. This is the attitude that Parliament, as you say, takes toward its colonies. It is sovereign and it will do what it chooses to do. And of course, that's part of the Declaratory Act later. But this leads me to you mentioned a couple things, and I want to try to bring us back around to those. So we know that in 1764, the first kind of concerted response of Virginia is the House of Burgesses puts together a petition to the king, memorials to the House of Lords, and then, of course, a remonstrance to the House of Commons. These are all just forms of protest. They transmit them to the agent for the Virginia colony round about December 1764. And then they just, the older guard at that point are kind of content to sit back and await response, right? We've done our part. We've protested. We've said our piece on this issue. And an up-and-comer at this point, by the surname Henry, he's not content to wait. And this leads to the production of another protest. So tell me about that.
You're referring to the resolves, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what, May 29th, 1765. He proposes 5 resolutions, and they, in effect, just reaffirm what Virginia has already said in that December 1764 remonstrance in not particularly heated language. I mean, the supposedly radical one is the 5th resolution, in which all he says is no taxation without representation. If you tax us without representation, it will destroy British freedom as well as American freedom. Right. And this is what the conservatives in the House are objecting to, so that
and that gets expunged. I mean, that's the next day that's wiped off the record.
Famously, Henry gives his Caesar had his Brutus speech, and Speaker Robinson is denouncing him, treason, treason. So they pass these resolutions. Henry takes off the next day, a little bit afraid there might actually be a warrant because of his comments that seem to suggest violence against the person of the king. And with him gone, they're able to, Robinson's able to he tries to expunge all of them, but they get rid of or repeal all of them. They get rid of the 5th one. Yeah. And this is considered a great victory, but it turns out it ends up being a victory for the radicals, because it's not when northern newspapers, I think starting with the Newport Mercury in Rhode Island, first publish news from Virginia, they not only have all 5 resolutions, including the one that was eliminated, but they have this 6th and 7th resolution.
Right.
And where the heck these came from, I still don't know, right? I don't think anyone knows for sure.
They didn't come from Henry. They didn't come from Henry.
It seems like they didn't, and I think maybe some Yankee radicals are kind of pulling strings here and kind of putting words in the mouth of Virginia. And these are definitely more radical in that I think the 6th calls for says that His Majesty's subjects have no duty to obey any law that taxes them without representation. So a call to disobedience of an act of Parliament that has been assented to by the king. All right, so they're playing a tough game there. And that 7th one is saying anyone who upholds the Stamp Act is an enemy of the country. It doesn't say that violence should be done against them, but that's the implication. So if we want to kind of figure out when the colonists make these initial petitions and Parliament ignores them, then Virginia passes these resolutions. Then we have this more radical version that's in the press, and that's the version that's published in port cities all over the colonies, and from New England to Savannah, people are saying, "My God, look at what Virginia just did." I mean, they're calling on their people.
We've got to one-up Virginia. Yeah, that's
right. To disobey the crown, and to by implication, suppress anyone who tries to enforce it. So this then leads to, or helps to explain, if the biggest, most populous, richest state is taking such a bold stand against the parliament and kind of the king too, this emboldens the other colonies to take their lead and gives a lot of steam to the radicals. But still, what can the legislators do? Virginia's tried and hasn't succeeded. The other legislatures follow Virginia's lead in passing more resolutions. In September and October and November, almost all the colonies follow their example with different degrees of radicalism. But there are other radicals who say maybe there are other things that we need to do. That seventh resolution is calling to treat enforcers of the Stamp Act as enemies of the people. Well, we hear this clown Andrew Oliver in Boston has agreed to collect the stamp or to distribute stamped paper. We need to put the fear of God into him. So you have the first of the Stamp Act riots, August 14th, 1765. I shouldn't say riot. At this point, it's a protest.
Yeah.
And this is where you have Liberty Tree being the location for Oliver being hung in effigy as a warning, and then they cut down the effigy and they burn it. And then there's a public demand in the newspaper for him to make clear that he will not accept the office of Stamp Act collector. Incidentally, they also go to his house and break some glass, and so it's already getting not riotous, but the crowd is in play here. It's not just the gentlemen and their legislatures. Then there will be subsequently 2 weeks later a true riot in which the lieutenant governor's house is attacked and ransacked, and here the real revolutionary, even social revolutionary potential is kind of being unleashed here. So, and then you have the Stamp Act Congress, where I guess the gentlemen legislators are trying to keep things from getting out of control while still opposing the British government in a way that is still not threatening violence. But there's that undercurrent of violence that is out there.
Yeah.
And I guess, go ahead.
I find this really, I find this really interesting. Obviously the Virginia Resolves are much better known than the Leedstown Resolutions. And of course, it looks like the reason for that, maybe simply because it was first, but also because, the fake news versions of the Virginia Resolves are what actually set the fires up and down the Atlantic coast. And again, with this kind of one-upsmanship, we've got to get in there. We've got to make sure that we are just as strenuous in our objections and strident in our tone as the Virginians have been. I find that fascinating, and so really, so at this point, you have, December 1764, the House of Burgesses have done their part. Henry's not really content with what they've done. He releases a version, right, again, that is fairly mild, but then the papers, spin it out of control a bit by adding these, phantom sixth and seventh resolutions that we don't know where they came from. And so at this point, really, and by the way, I think Henry does this because he says, look, implementation of this policy begins soon. This is November 1st. There's an enact date of November 1 on the Stamp Act. So at that point, after Patrick Henry has finished with the resolves and he hightails it out of there, and of course the folks who were meeting, Richard Henry was not a part of he wasn't at the House of Burgesses to vote on those resolves, and that's because he was dealing with an embezzlement issue in the House. But at that point,
our friend John Robinson, the guy who put the kibosh on Henry,
who had in fact been tanking the Virginia economy a bit by embezzling paper money. Anyway, at this point, Virginians have really exhausted their available political tools, and they have been unsuccessful in changing policy. And as you say, things are kind of snowballing in the northern colonies in terms of these loosely organized bands of brothers letting their displeasure about the Stamp Act be known in a variety of ways. Dealing with the Stamp Act distributor Andrew Oliver, And so really in Virginia, that is kind of what happens as well. When it is, I think it's understood that the official protests and the resolutions, the resolves, the resolutions, these haven't had any effect, and we're not changing policy, and so now we're going to pivot to obstructing implementation, which is precisely what happens in Virginia. And of course, what does it mean to obstruct the implementation of the Stamp Act? Well, it means to really effectively attack the face of the Stamp Act here in the colonies, and those are the stamp distributors, Andrew Oliver in Massachusetts, and of course George Mercer here in Virginia. And
So just as the Virginia resolutions, at least the fake version of them, help to inspire what the Sons of Liberty are doing in Massachusetts,
yeah,
what the Sons of Liberty do in Massachusetts are doing in August
yes,
1765 helps to inspire what the Virginians then do, at least in the Northern Neck, in September 1765.
that's right.
Um,
Well,
so you want to give us a quick rundown of like the
yeah.
Mercer protest? Just
Oh yes. Oh, so I mean, and this for me, this is like I think Patrick and I have just for those of you who are listening, I think this is all like this is phase one. What we just got completed now is kind of phase one, an attempt to change policy. And after that has proved unsuccessful, now we have the pivot to the obstruction of implementation of the Stamp Act. And that really begins for me in September of 1765. September 23rd is the day. It's court day in Montrose. And this is the day that Richard Henry Lee of Chantilly, Stratford and Chantilly, indulges in a bit of political theater. And that theater is targeting the recently appointed stamp distributor, George Mercer. And by the way, how stamp distribution works is just simply, right, you pay the tax and you get stamped paper. That's what it was all about. And it came with a nice wage. And of course, this is why it would have been attractive to Mercer. It was also attractive to Richard Henry. That's another story. But so what Richard Henry does is he stages again a bit of this political theater in downtown Montrose. It's kind of a wild atmosphere. It's a monthly court day already. And Richard Henry has some of his enslaved and indentured process down Main Street to the courthouse. Some are wearing the livery of John Wilkes, someone who was seen to be a champion of rights, a British publisher. And some of them are naked. And they're hauling a cart that contains effigies of George Grenville, Prime Minister, who was widely seen to be the brain trust behind the Stamp Act. And then George Mercer, these effigies were being hauled in the cart. They were taken downtown to the courthouse, where there was this kind of they were, like I said, they were variously dressed, but the effigies were beaten, they were hung, they were eventually burned. But it was all in this kind of like the spirit of a mock trial. And Richard Henry Lee was the master of ceremonies. And he read a confession that he had extracted from this effigy of George Mercer, which, where Mercer effectively says something like, "Money is my God. I've erred grievously against my fellow colonists," etc. So this is he's ginning up kind of anger is really what he's doing. That's the simplest way to think about what this procession is up to. It's really getting popular resentment boiling hot. And on the very same day, Richard Henry, well, the justices at the courthouse tender their intent to resign effective November 1. Richard Henry Lee is one of those justices. So he does two things that day. He stages this kind of bizarre procession where he's suggesting in kind of a high-handed way that, quite frankly, the British intent is to denude us, thus these enslaved and indentured folks in their birthday suits wandering down the streets toward the courthouse. And really at the root of all of this is greed, the greed of folks like Mercer, of folks like Grenville. And again, this is for popular folks. And it was a great carnival atmosphere. And then at the same time, you have the justices who resign their positions effective November 1. And so then the tail end of that story is simply that when George Mercer arrives in the colonies, he's still in England. He's been appointed stamp distributor. He's on his way. He's on his way with stamped paper in September. He arrives in October. He arrives in Williamsburg on October 30th, where he's met by a mob who are steamed. They're angry and they want answers, and what they want is for him to say that he will resign. He begs time to think about it. They don't want to give him time to think about it, but eventually he prevails upon them to give him a day. And the next day, he tries to resign. Mercer tries to resign his post, again under pressure from the mobs. And of course, what happens is that Francis Fauquier says, "Look, you can't resign without instructions from Parliament and the King." So Mercer says, "Well, I will return to England for instructions, and I will not do anything without the assent of the Virginia Assembly." And that's the Mercer story, right? So again, obstructing the implementation of the Stamp Act. You've taken the stamp distributor out of the game. You've closed the courts. And as of November 2, right, all this said, so into phase one, courts are closed, stamp distributors hightailing it back to England. November 2, everything is business as usual. They proceed about their business without any use of stamped paper.
One thing we might note here before pushing on our roads to Leedstown is that it would be premature at this point to say that anything that's happened points toward the American Revolution, because all this political behavior that we're describing is in keeping with British political norms. On the outer edge of it, to be sure, but it was considered normal for the crowd to have some say in political events and to be able to shoot its mouth off, right? And you mentioned John Wilkes, the British politician in 1763-64. He is using the crowd to, as he see it, defend British liberties, and using theatrics to try to get them out of the street and direct their anger towards the ministry. As a quick further background,
I wanted to ask you about that. So, I mean, what Richard Henry Lee does works, right? I mean, he's aiming to gin up resentment. That's what happens. By the time Mercer gets into Virginia, right, there's no tolerance for what he's about to do, what he's been engaged to do, and he hightails it out of there. But so one of the things I wanted to ask you, so we've been talking about what's happening in the northern colonies, what's happening down in Virginia. I guess the big question is, what have the British been up to this entire time?
Yeah. So, and one thing to keep in mind, while the Stamp Act is passed by a huge margin in the House of Commons and unanimously in the House of Lords, there are English statesmen who vehemently oppose it as an invasion of English constitutional rights, including the right to not be taxed without consent. And then you have, and they understand that there, or at least as they see it, there is a principle at stake in that that if the ministry gets away with this with the Americans, it could mean more oppression at home. And this is not a fantasy. It's not some conspiracy. In the wake of the French and Indian War, Parliament does pass in 1763 the Cider Act, which is a sales tax. And how do the English respond? They respond with crowd protests and carrying George Grenville around in effigy, right? So when the Bostonians do it, and then when the Williamsburgers, when Richard Henry Lee is doing this, carrying George Grenville around in effigy, this is in keeping. I'm sorry, Montrose. Yeah, this is in keeping with how you expect freedom-loving Englishmen to behave. They're not necessarily proto-revolutionaries, right? And the hope is still
normal political behavior so far.
It is, yeah. It's certainly raucous and sometimes it's bordering on riot, but not quite. It doesn't cross that legal line clearly. And the the Americans, in resisting the Stamp Act in what is so far a bloodless way, they have their champions in Britain, and then when there's a change in ministry, when the Duke of Rockingham becomes prime minister, he
Right.
immediately starts talking about, okay, this is not working. This is a bad idea. We need to think about getting rid of this thing. And when Parliament reconvenes in this is January 14th, 1766,
Right.
the immediate question is, should the Stamp Act be repealed? It's extremely rare to repeal an act of Parliament. After it's been agreed to by the king, that is it, right? So it's
Right.
extraordinary to even have this conversation. And that's a testament to
How
just
much
how
noise
much
was being made.
the Americans had successfully made their case, right? Not to
Right.
convince them, but
Right.
just to create enough chaos that the
Right.
British are afraid. There is some talk in America of like this could destroy the empire, right? There could even be the quote unquote a civil war between Britain and her colonies. So
And of
on
course, the
January,
London merchants, all the London merchants
yeah.
are saying, look, you're interfering with trade. These boycotts are going to be no good that we're being threatened with. So, yeah.
And then in steps or limps William Pitt, the former prime minister, who gives this searing 3-hour speech, famous, and he becomes beloved, even more beloved in the colonies for it,
At
in the
which Arthur
strongest
Lee was present.
language, huh?
At which Arthur Lee was present.
At which Arthur Lee is a witness,
Yeah.
is saying, you say that the Americans have resisted. It's glorious that they've resisted. They would have been slaves if they would have submitted to this, right? And he upholds the principle of no taxation without representation, which is extraordinary. He takes their side in this. So momentum begins to build towards repeal on constitutional, parliamentary, legal grounds. Parliament will revoke the law.
And that's, of
Um,
course, because it's also being backed by some of the great jurists in the House of Lords. Again, I would be remiss not to mention Charles Pratt, the Baron Camden at this time, one of the greatest jurists of this particular period, who has really doubled down with Pitt on the principle in fact, I think he says something like, representation and taxation are equivalents, right? I mean,
right. So in both the Commons and the Lords, the Americans have their British champions. However, even though these arguments are being made, you still cannot get a majority in favor of repeal by saying Parliament doesn't have the right to tax the colonies. The majority uh, of 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 parliamentarians are just not willing to concede that point. So, but making the argument that the London merchants are upset about this, it could lead to civil war, making these more pragmatic arguments builds the majority, and eventually at the end of February, both houses agree to repeal, and then in March the king signs the repeal of the Stamp Act. And as
and
Monty
the
Python
duty.
say, there was much rejoicing. Like when news gets to America, there's this celebration that isn't it great that our liberties are secure under British law and within the British Empire, and no violence was necessary. We didn't have to take up arms. Now,
Right.
of course, that's looking ahead to what we know is repeal. In
That's
February
April,
1766,
right? I
Virginia
mean,
doesn't know that this is going to happen, right?
that's right. And I think what Boston doesn't know until April, right? Something like that. Is that right?
I think it's early April.
Yeah. Same in Philadelphia,
Might have
right?
actually been yeah, it might have even been mid March. No, it may have been early May. I have to check, but it's in February. It's not news has not gotten to them, even from Arthur Lee, that
Right.
that
There's a
this
month
thing
and
is going to be
change.
repealed, right?
Right. Right.
So I
So
guess that leads us to the next phase.
yeah, and this is so this is phase two. I mean, everything is. I mean, look at it. From a certain point of view, apart from just kind of the indignity and outrage that has been ginned up by the Stamp Act, or right, the threat of the Stamp Act, everything is good in Virginia, right? They've made their protest. Policy hasn't worked. They've obstructed the implementation. They've by getting effectively driving the stamp distributor out of Virginia back to England, sending him home, home with his tail between his legs. They've closed the courts. The courts aren't doing any business, and by the way, that's fine. Virginia was a particularly litigious society anyway. They can deal without a couple months of no court cases. That's fine. But all of a sudden, there's a flurry of activity beginning, and again, dates are uncertain here, but beginning late January, early February, certainly. There's a flurry of activity, and it centers on a merchant from Hobbs Hole, current day Tappahannock, whose name is Archibald Ritchie. I'm sure that some of you who are logged in and listening, participating with us, understand exactly who Archibald Ritchie was. And apparently, as the story goes, Archibald Ritchie, and probably on court day in Richmond County, decided to state publicly his intent to clear his ships. Right? Remember, papers require stamps. He was going to clear his ships from port to sell the grain that he had bought in English markets using stamped paper. He stated publicly this is what he was going to do, right? And there are even accounts. He said that his family depended on this. And right. So he just had to make this terrible sacrifice so that he could get these funds for his family. Anyway, Ritchie's announcement that he's going to do this is really the flashpoint for the Stamp Act becoming extremely real in Virginia, but extremely real in the Northern Neck. And we have a chain of letters really being exchanged among the gentry. What are we going to do about this guy, right? He's made everything was fine. We were kind of in the default mode of, well, business as usual. We're just not going to use the stamped paper. Besides, Mercer said he didn't have any anyway. One of the things that Ritchie ended up saying was, not only am I going to clear my ships, I know where to get some stamped paper. So all of a sudden, and this, by the way, talk about another historical mystery. Where was the stamped paper that he was referring to? Anyway, what happens is the first week of February, Richard Henry Lee begins sending letters out to folks. Sending them to, for example, Samuel Washington and his brother Thomas Ludwell Lee, some of his other brothers, some of his other cronies, the Carters, and a conversation gets going. This guy is a problem. Everything was fine. And then he states his intent to clear his ships using this stamped paper, which interrupts, right, what we've done. And there's a great letter. I'll read just a bit of it here. This is from Sam Washington, one of George's younger brothers. I think it's his next younger brother, to Richard Henry Lee. And it's dated February 22nd. And he says, "Dear sir," this is to Richard Henry, "I received your favor of the 7th instant." So Richard Henry Lee sends him a letter on the 7th, informing me of Ritchie's imprudence in declaring he would send for stamped paper to clear out his vessel for the West Indies, but I postponed answering it until I collected the opinion of some of my neighbors on that lead, and have now the pleasure of informing you that many are ready at a moment's warning to assist in anything destructive to him or his intentions in the meantime, etc., etc. And then he says, "Whether or not, please to inform me of the time and place when we may assemble and effectually prevent such destructive precedents, and lest that fellow knows that the north side of the Tappahannock will not be passive." Okay, so Washington's ready to ride in support of any measure Richard Henry Lee effectively deems appropriate for Ritchie. There's another, and by the way, he's also out, right, getting the opinion of others in the community, asking for their support as well. So this is kind of spreading like wildfire, this story about Ritchie and what he intends to do, and then what will our response be? That's kind of where it is.
And that's when you have was it February 21st? When did you had Waring and Rowan lead the Essex County folks to Tappahannock to have a conversation with Ritchie about this?
That's right. So the first people to respond to, Ritchie's actually, Tappahannock's in Essex County. He was a merchant, so he was, and by the way, he was a well-known merchant, I should say. He did business with George Washington. He did business with a lot of folks, a lot of important people. But on the 21st of February, Essex County residents decided they were going to deal with this matter on their own. And so they went to his house in Tappahannock and kind of gave him the what for about his stated intent to clear his ships using this stamped paper. There are multiple reports about what happened. Many of them conflict, but Francis Waring and William Roane were the ringleaders of kind of demanding that he repent of this intent. Some say that a British man of war that was anchored in at Hobbs Hole, disgorged a detachment of troops to disperse the crowd that had gathered at Ritchie's house. Others say that Ritchie, in fact, gave his, he said, "Look, mea culpa, I'm sorry about this. I don't intend to go through with it." Um, that was February 21st. But it didn't subside, and it seems like, in some letters that you can read from Richard Henry Lee at the time, it seems like there was some indication that maybe Ritchie had drawn back from his original position, that Richard Henry knew about it, and that all the other ringleaders of the Leedstown resolutions knew about it, but it wasn't enough. And my theory about why it wasn't enough is because Ritchie made his statement in public on court day. And any retraction had to have a similar kind of audience and a similar kind of official, right? I suppose veneer laid atop it. And so I don't think so. If it was the case that on the 21st, when Waring and Roane showed up at Ritchie's house demanding that he repent, if anything happened to that effect, it wasn't enough. It was deemed not sufficient, right? Perhaps because it was private, and that'll become a contentious point later. But so one of the things that we then see, and this is on, I believe, the big letter that is written by Thomas Ludwell Lee, is on the 24th, and he says, and just a little bit from Thomas Ludwell Lee here to Richard Henry Lee. He says, "My dear brother, I've conferred with T. Mason," that's Thompson Mason, the younger brother of George W. Brent, and C. Bullitt upon the subject of your letter, and we have concluded that the most effectual and in all respects the most advisable method will be to pay Mr. Ritchie a visit and to insist on a declaration from him in writing, expressing the deepest sorrow for having formed so execrable a design, and promising in the most solemn manner never to use the stamp paper unless authorized by the Assembly of Virginia." So those were maybe some of the things that hadn't happened. And this is what Thomas Ludwell Lee is now insisting on, right? We're going to pay him a visit. We want this declaration in writing. We want it promised in a solemn manner. And we want him to agree never to use stamp paper unless authorized by the Assembly. He also then says that, I have my cronies out in the community, beating the bushes to get folks to ride that way. And he goes on to say, "We propose to be in Leedstown in the afternoon of the 27th, where we expect to meet those who will come from your way." And now, Patrick, you and I were talking about this afternoon. It's a great text. It's really remarkable for its time. And I think this probably is some of the animus here that we find in the Leedstown resolutions themselves. Thomas Ludwell Lee goes on to say, "Ritchie's profligacy is rather to be esteemed fortunate. The genius of liberty requires to be awakened. Nothing contributes more than achievements of this kind, well timed and prudently conducted, to animate the virtuous and deter the profligate. It's proposed that all who have swords and pistols shall ride with them, and those who choose at a firelock. Some precaution of this kind may be necessary, as Ritchie, should he get intelligence, may, if surrounded by his fierce North Britons, sustained by the crews of some vessels with arms in their hands, reduce us to the necessity of a shameful retreat." And then here comes my favorite line in this letter. He says, "This is not probable, it's not very probable, but the infant struggles of freedom should not be exposed to the possibility of a defeat."
An astonishing document you found there, Gordon.
It
Really,
is. It's true.
I will tell you, I mean, it's really, I won't say unprecedented, but I can't think of other examples in this period of protesters showing up with cutlasses, pistols, and firelocks. I mean, when you have fast forward to the Boston Massacre, and with this first kind of outpouring of blood, the crowd is armed with clubs and rocks and oyster shells and snowballs, right? That's
Right.
considered the weapons that lead to this confrontation. But to actually take up arms to try to terrorize Ritchie into renouncing the Stamp Act, it is as close to a kind of that shift from British norms to armed resistance, which has this, points towards revolution,
Mm.
not necessarily against the crown, not necessarily about independence, but making that shift into a war stance. I don't know of much of anything. I mean, like the regulator movement in North Carolina, but other than that,
Right.
anything really comparable in writing by leaders of the country like the Lees
Right.
until we're getting to like 1774 on the eve of revolution. It's an amazing letter, and the Leedstown Resolves that flows out of it is an amazing document.
Well, that's right. And so that led the last line of that particular letter, right after he says the infant struggles of freedom should not be exposed to the possibility of defeat. He says this will be a fine opportunity, the 27th will be a fine opportunity to effect the scheme of an association, and I should be glad if you would think of a plan.
So there's the association and the resolves. The whole plan is there. Yeah.
Right, right. And so on the 27th, um, there's an agreement by all the folks who've been contacted, right? All these letters that have been exchanged among the gentry, among VIPs in the neighboring counties of the Northern Neck. On the 27th, a group, right, meets at the town of Leeds on the banks of the Rappahannock, and there they put pen to paper on a document that I think has clearly been drafted by Richard Henry Lee and corresponds with everything that he's ever said about these issues in his writings. And they form a committee. And I think the committee that's formed is independent of you have the resolutions, but at the same time, the reason they're there is because Ritchie, right? And so their task that evening at Leedstown is to come up with a plan for dealing with Ritchie, which is what they do. Right? They come up with this idea that he's going to take a particular kind of oath. He's going to sign an X document, and it's going to say this.
But
So
not
this
in
committee,
itself, as you say with the Thomas Ludwell article, it's to make an example of him to prevent anyone else from following
that's
his
right.
example and letting this thing be executed.
That's right. And that's one of the things I love about Thomas Ludwell Lee, who's the older brother here. I mean, he says, look, this is an opportunity for an object lesson. And it's something certainly that, Richard Henry Lee will confirm in a later writing where he says, look, if Ritchie falls, then the rest go. And once the rest of the merchants go, right, this is going to seep into the courts. And once it seeps into the courts, it's going to seep then into other business transactions. And pretty soon, so again, it's really kind of like the slippery slope problem that they're dealing with here. So they're determined to make an object lesson of Ritchie, and of course that's what happens the very next day. So after the signing of the resolution, of course, those of you who know the resolutions understand that there's one of the resolutions is to collect as many signatures as possible. Not all of the 115 men who signed this document were at Leedstown on the 27th, right? This document was circulated probably for some time afterward. But there was a core group there, and inside that core group there was a committee, and that committee was responsible for drafting what would be the plan of action on the 28th, when from Leedstown they took the ferry to Leighton Landing and then rode to Hobbs Hole, where they confronted Mr. Ritchie at his home. Ritchie, of course, was very reluctant to come out of his home and tried to deal with the committee. And it was the smaller committee who went up to the door, who he didn't want to come out to. Of course, one of the great stories about the ride to Tappahannock to Hobbs Hole on the 28th is we're talking about in the neighborhood of 300 to 400 men, armed men, right, who have ridden that day to Hobbs Hole.
It's a small
Robert,
army.
yeah, Robert Wormley Carter gives the number 300. He says there were about 300 people there. armed men lining the streets. The committee, right, goes to the door of Richie, invites him to participate in this ritual that they have prepared for him. He is, of course, reluctant to do so. He wants it conducted privately, and he's kind of pleading for some kind of intermediate measures. They are not in agreement whatsoever with any of these intermediate measures, and they force his hand, and he signs a recantation. In fact, he gives the crowd exactly what Thomas Ludwell Lee said he should give them. And what's fascinating about that is Robert Wormley Carter, who was one of the signers of the Leedstown resolutions, his diary entry for March 1st, 1766 says this, quote, "Just returned from Hobbs Hole, where I met a large company of gentlemen who assembled to compel Mr. Archibald Ritchie to sign a paper wherein he confessed his remorse at the declaration of his intention to clear out on stamped paper, and solemnly swore never in any manner whatever to use stamped paper. This he did in the most impudent way I ever saw anything done, although surrounded by about 300 men who were justly incensed at his behavior, and who were most all, well armed."
Wow, all or most all.
Yeah. So, and Carter says, like, Richie wasn't happy, right? He wanted this to be a private affair between gentlemen inside his house, right? He didn't want to be dragged out of his home, made to read a public declaration again, where he recants his intent. So that's where are we here on our time? That's the 28th. I mean, we're almost done here. So that's the 28th. And
Just as a quick exclamation point to all that, if we may be mystified as to why this intense language is in the Leedstown Resolves, unlike anything else that's being done in the Stamp Act crisis in America, and why these guys are coming, hundreds of guys showing up armed to confront this one dude, it helps us to understand how they perceive it, that everything's at stake here. If Ritchie falls, the other merchants will comply. If the merchants comply, the courts will comply. We lose everything. And I would add to that, if Virginia then falls, all the other colonies fall. Just as Virginia led in radicalism and the other colonies followed in radicalism, or at least it seemed like Virginia was leading a radical path. So if Virginia then complies, at that point, it won't matter what's going on in Parliament. If news gets to Britain, guess what? The Virginians are complying with the Stamp Act now. The rest will fall in line. That's it. American history goes in a completely different course. We become Canada, which is the worst possible thing that could happen, right?
All due respect to Canadians. Yeah, I think you asked me days ago, and it's a great question, which is, whence the intensity? And one of the things I said to you earlier today was that the intensity is there because these men who signed this document didn't think of themselves as a powerful, organized body of men, right, able to do whatever they wished. They felt themselves to be men whose backs were against the wall for a variety of reasons. Again, the Stamp Act was in many ways the latest indignity. We could talk about some of those indignities if you all want to do that. But these men did not feel themselves to be a coherent band, right, all pulling or pushing in the same direction. They saw themselves as a group of folk deeply indebted, right, on the cusp of falling into even greater debt, having their liberties reduced ever further. And again, so their backs were against the wall. It's like, why would men who had so much to lose do something like this? The answer is because they felt that they were already suffering an enormous amount of loss. So this was just compounding their loss. This was, and again, I think you point to exactly the right thing. I mean, to them, Ritchie was this kind of symbolic, right, line in the sand. All right, here or else there's going to be a collapse, right, of all sort of the systems, and we will lose our rights over and over again, ever more repeatedly, etc. So there we are with, I think we've come to the end of what you and I can do, Patrick. At this point, maybe I should ask folks to pose their questions that they have in the question and answer, the Q&A box there. We'd love to be able to answer some questions. Otherwise, we'll just continue talking because this is what Patrick and I do when we get together.
Right. And there's so much that we could have covered that we couldn't in an hour. We didn't get that much into the Westmoreland Association. So if there's anyone out there who wants to raise any of these subjects, we're happy to address it.
Oh, this is great. So I see. Okay, an absolutely dumb question for context. Doctor, I don't think that's true. There are no such dumb questions. That's what college professors and former college professors are trained to say. Does Lee have any relationship with Leeds and later Leedstown? Probably not. I think the reference to Leeds, it just called Leeds. Before that, it was called Bray's Church, and then it was established as Leeds on the Rappahannock. I think that's because of Lord Fairfax. Leeds was the ancestral home of Lord Fairfax, and I believe that the town was named to honor Lord Fairfax. Ginger, I saw your hand up, but can you possibly place your question in the Q&A box? That'd be great. Dr. Betts, I hope that answered your question.
Right, Beth?
I will add, okay. Has there been any archaeology at Bray's Church is a question that we're getting. There has been. I don't know. I think the church, the ruins of the church, the foundation of the church, Bray's Church, is still there. Not much else. I mean, the first one, again, like I said, I began working at Stratford in 2022, and one of the things I wanted to do was to drive down to Leedstown, and I was remarkably underwhelmed by what I saw there. I mean, apart from the natural beauty, there really isn't much of that town left, and that town withered away in the mid-19th century, although I understand there was something of that church standing into the 20th century. Very little is left. Some of the pieces of stone that were used to build the church were repurposed in other construction around the northern neck. I don't know of anyone. I mean, I think a lot of the archaeology that's been done in and around Bray's Church has pertained to the native populations, the Rappahannock tribe, that occupied that land ancestrally. Are there okay, other questions? Yeah, so the okay. Two really, Patrick, this one's for you. An anonymous attendee asked, was giving the colonies representation considered?
Not seriously, no. Partly it was the logistics involved of travel across the Atlantic that kind of made it problematic. There were Americans who did, and there were some English radicals who were saying that there could be delegates who would be, who would stay in London. Of course, getting information from the colonies to them, again, it's still problematic. So logistically, it was, I don't want to say something that never could have happened, but it was not very doable. Mostly what the colonists would say was, well, we're not actually asking to be represented in Parliament. What we're saying is we're already represented in our own assemblies, and our assemblies should retain the authority to tax us, and Parliament simply shouldn't have that authority over us at all. So I don't want to say that when anyone, there were a few people, I think James Otis at one point suggested colonial representation in Parliament. Of course, he was having some mental trouble at the time, but maybe he didn't think it through as like a compromise position. But this was more just a way to avoid the issue, and the issue was either Parliament doesn't tax the colonies or the colonies tax themselves, and there really wasn't a middle way. There wasn't a way to square that circle in a way that would work practically.
Yeah, the communication technologies were not in place for this kind of thing to work.
We're talking about like typically like a 3-week journey back and forth across the Atlantic in good weather,
and that's a
um,
yeah, that's a fast one. Yeah.
yeah, it's a very fast one.
So Patricia Richards asks, how did the riders cross the Rappahannock River from Westmoreland County to Essex County to pay Mr. Ritchie that visit? Great question. Leedstown had a ferry that worked from Leedstown to just below Leedstown on the Rappahannock to a place called Layton's Landing and Wharf. There was a wharf there. So they took the ferry across the Rappahannock from Leedstown to Layton's Landing and rode the 15 some miles from Layton's Landing to, so from Stratford, it's about, say 12 miles down to Leedstown. Leedstown, you take the ferry across. It's a very short ferry ride. And from Layton's Landing, it's about 15 miles down to Hobbs Hole from there. Virginia Collier asks, this is someone I know, and she asks, she always asks difficult questions. She says, I've read that RHL, Richard Henry Lee, initially applied to represent the Crown in selling stamped paper. He was not chosen, and some have said that his passion against the Stamp Act originated from being rejected. Can you comment on this? Yeah, I can comment on this. But, and I think you're right. I read a lot of that too. A lot of it. He was angry for being rejected, and therefore he became a very passionate patriot. That just doesn't wash for me, right? A lot of people, suggest that Martin Luther came up with his theology because he was constipated. I hate these kinds of explanations, right? If the anger of rejection drove him into just makes no sense. I think that Richard Henry Lee was deeply in debt. He had a very large family. And like most large tidewater planters, the tobacco trade in the 60s was remarkably volatile. What with the tobacco lords, the Glaswegian tobacco lords, what with the Stamp Act, what with the Sugar Act. Richard Henry Lee needed income. And so he threw his name into the hat initially and again, remember, a lot of folks didn't think the Stamp Act was going to be a big deal. It turned out to be a big deal, but he threw his name in the hat initially to be considered for a stamp distributor. He says that it was only a matter of days before he reconsidered his position once he he wrote a public acknowledgement that, hey, at first I didn't do the right thing. I put my name in the hat, but days later I really decided that this isn't something that I could get behind. He was looking for a source of revenue, but and again, for me, I accept his explanation that it was he hastily considered at first, but more reflection brought him round to an alternative view. And I think if you judge him by his actions and by some of the things that he's saying in letters around this time, in proposing, for example, to petition the king and the House of Lords and the House of Commons on the issue, what he does then, of course, later with Mercer. By the way, it's Mercer's family who brings up the fact that Richard Henry Lee threw his name in the hat. That's where this comes from. And it's their argument that he did this because he was angry that he wasn't chosen to be the stamp distributor. I understand the position. Boy, that's a lot of sincerity that you're going to have to sham later on to get behind the cause in the way that Richard Henry Lee seems to have done.
For the rest of his life. He
Yeah,
puts on a really good show for the rest of his life. Yeah.
But I will say this, Ginger, and I think that when he burned, I said this to Patrick earlier, when he burned George Mercer in effigy at that parade in September 1765 in Montrose, I think that some of that was the intensity of his political theater in the streets of Montrose and the intensity with which he pursued a case against Ritchie had to do with this initial footfall that he had made and deep regret about it. So I think the intensity was related to the shame that he felt as a man of honor for not thinking this through clearly from the very beginning. Hope that answers. Hope that helps. Michael Fraser says, were all the delegates to the Constitutional Convention fully aware of the various phases you've discussed? Was it because of the various committees of correspondence or similar groups? The phase is just the way I think in terms of the phases, that's just the way I tend to think about the moment that Virginia, the colony of Virginia, there's a set of official responses that it makes via the House of Burgesses. And then after those responses are made, there's a kind of default position where we're not going to comply. We're just not going to comply. And that's being enforced at the local level in many counties across Virginia at that point. And then Ritchie, for me, initiates the second phase. This is the way that I think about it, right? When now something has to be done because the kind of the state that we had fallen into after our official protest, right, failed to change policy. We obstructed successfully the implementation by driving Grenville back. And so then everything was just business as usual, no stamped paper until Ritchie. That was the second phase. You'll have to say more about, was it because the various committees of correspondence or similar groups? They were, I think, Patrick, you suggested this, that of course, where Virginia lights the fires, those fires are then kind of enhanced and returned to Virginia. Right? Is that fair to say?
The committees of correspondence don't really get going until 1768, 69 with the Townsend Acts. But once they do, that system enables a level of coordination among and the radical core within each legislature, so these legislatures can start kind of coordinating. But I don't know if that's what Mike was getting
at. That may be. I see that Stephen is asking, how do the Leedstown resolutions language compare to the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, so I mean, you do have the line about that their lives and fortunes are at stake, just like lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. Obviously, by the time the Declaration is passed, we're a year into the war, right? And there's been so much bloodshed, there's no going back. So it's a very different context. There's still the language about liberty and property. The right to not be taxed is founded in reason, custom, and reason, law, and custom.
Yeah.
Richard Henry says. So there's, in terms of principles, I think the same principles are there that we see in the Declaration, and those principles really form the core of just about everything that the Patriots are doing from the Stamp Act all the way through to independence. I think maybe another question would be, how do the Leedstown Resolves compare with other resolutions that come later before the actual war?
Like the Fairfax,
like the Fairfax Resolves in 1774, which has some of the same crowd involved. It's George Mason there and George Washington there. It's Thompson. Thompson Mason with Leedstown. With Fairfax, there is the idea of repressing as an enemy to the public anyone who sides with taxation without representation. There is the hope vested that non-importation and ostracism, social and economic pressure can be enough to prevent war. But the Fairfax resolutions also have this dark undercurrent of saying, but if these fail, we'll have to appeal to heaven. We'll have to do the one thing that's left to us. It doesn't say take up arms, but it's clearly a very clear allusion that would have been appreciated at the time of this is the last ditch effort to try to have some peaceful, non-violent, or at least non-bloodshed way of stopping this British policy to avoid war, but clearly we're at a point at which it's now or nothing. And if Britain doesn't back down, then it's got to be war. And we know what happens, right? We're not at that point with Leedstown, but the willingness to even consider some kind of violence, or to say we're staking our lives, we're going to fight we're going to oppose this to the last extremity, um, we're going to oppose this to the utmost,
Yeah.
shows that they really believe their rights are at stake, and that that submission means some kind of slavery.
Yeah, there's
So
some very
there's that
strong.
potential for violence there from the beginning.
Yeah, yeah, I think there's violence in the language of Leedstown.
Yeah.
Certainly. I mean, the word danger is used multiple
Over and
times
over. Danger and
throughout.
disgrace.
Yeah, danger, disgrace, punishment. Yeah, I think one of the things an interesting coda to some of this that I just discovered yesterday, which I'll share with the group, and then maybe I want to ask Patrick one more question. When the Stamp Act was repealed, obviously, as Patrick said earlier, there was much rejoicing, right? I mean, you get stories of what was happening in Boston, stories of what was happening in Philadelphia. Great celebrations were happening, fireworks, bells were ringing in Philadelphia, etc. One of the things that happened down Essex County Way, the haunt of Archibald Ritchie and others, there was a fisticuffs.
Yeah.
And this is a great story, but it pertains really to, like, a lot of these resolves, you look at them and okay, you lose focus on some of them because you're so focused on the ones that are abrasive and assertive. But this one pertains to the sixth of the resolution. So a man named John Sears and a Mr. Call apparently got into a fisticuffs in Essex County because Mr. Sears took umbrage that Mr. Call was not sufficiently celebrating, not adequately celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act. And he said to him, "Hey, buddy, you need to be more celebrated. You need to enjoy this more. You need to celebrate this more." Turns out Mr. Call was a Tory. He was not at all happy about the repeal of the Stamp Act, right? And so they came to blows. And Mr. Call took Mr. Sears to court, and he got a judgment against him, in fact, a monetary judgment against him. And he couldn't pay. And so what happened? Well, the Association of Westmoreland came to his rescue and paid his court fees for him. Because, again, six, if any attempt shall be made upon the liberty, property of any associate for any action or thing to be done in consequence of this agreement, we solemnly bind ourselves, right, to restore such associate to his liberty, to protect him in the enjoyment of his property. So the Westmoreland Association got involved to pay for someone who had gotten into an altercation as a result of the repeal of the Stamp Act. The contributors there were six members of the Lee family who contributed to that, but there were others. But Patrick, and this is the question I want to ask. I want to make sure I ask it before too many more folks get off as we're going over our time. But it's probably the most important thing, and we didn't ultimately get round to it because we could go on about this document forever. But the thing that makes this different, the thing that, a lot of us in the Northern Neck feel that there's something to this document that sets it apart. We like to say that it stands at the headwaters of the American Revolution. We like to say that it stands at the dawn of the American Revolution in a particular way that stands out from, say, other resolutions that were being published in the months of February in places like Connecticut and other places. What is it about this that makes it different, that makes it worth paying more attention to than the attention that has been paid to it, which, as I think we mentioned earlier, is not enough?
I think partly it's one thing we've addressed, and that is the violence of the rhetoric that does point towards armed resistance as being a possibility of Britain persistence in its policies. Another is the creation of the Westmoreland Association of Patriots. As we all know in the audience here, the enforcement of the Stamp Act is shut down by these shadowy groups called the Sons of Liberty that first they originate in Boston in August 1765, and they pop up in most of the colonies, but they're working outside of the regular legal process, and they're using the crowd to try to put pressure first on Stamp Act officials, but then obviously these groups persist and become kind of the vanguard of the revolution through the 1760s.
Right.
But the Westmoreland Association is different. This group is a public organization. They sign, they make a public oath, religiously binding, appealing
Yes.
to religion and virtue. They vow to come together and to maintain vigilance against the Stamp Act and to protect each other, their liberty and property, in extraordinary language. But they do this as an open public act. And there's
They sign their
the
names.
they sign their names. And then when they function as an institution, they keep public records. They keep votes. When they raise money through a subscription to buy a portrait to honor Lord Camden for his opposition to the Stamp Act, we have the names of the people who contributed money. This is not true with any of the other Sons of Liberty. They are very careful to make sure that the authorities don't know who they are. They meet in private places. They don't keep records, which is one reason we don't know very much about them. We can kind of infer who was involved, but we don't know. In Westmoreland County, we know exactly who was involved, and there was no attempt to conceal it. The fact that they function like this, the Westmoreland Association, I would hypothesize, goes on to become a model for other similar political organizations of the sort that will lead democratic reform movements and even democratic revolutions in England in the 1760s, 1770s, on into the 19th century. The first example would be the Society for Gentlemen Supporters of the Bill of Rights, which was created in 1769 in defense of John Wilkes's cause, Arthur Lee being one of the founders.
Right.
And it also it functions publicly with public records and subscriptions and votes, and all this is recorded. And I wonder if it is not taking its model directly from the Westmoreland Association, which has this Lee connection. And then other organizations and revolutionary organizations in Ireland and then in France, the Jacobin Club, they're all following this model. Well, this model to some degree is based on gentlemen clubs in England that go way back in the 18th century, but
Right.
the creation of one for a political purpose, I think it starts with the Westmoreland Association of Patriots, which is huge. I mean,
Yeah.
this organization, which doesn't last very long,
No.
in this place, the Northern Neck, which does not get a lot of attention anymore, you could kind of see it as a hinge in the rise of the age of democratic revolutions. Maybe I'm claiming too much, but I think there's really something there.
No, I think that's important. I think it's also, the anonymity of the Sons of Liberty is something that stands in stark contrast to, men signing their names, their well-known names. And I do want to point out that it's the Westmoreland Association, but it's, again, there are 12 different counties represented in this document, but these are men who are well known. These are men of the community. And so you can't chalk it up to miscreants in the dark, right, wearing disguises. These are men who have stepped forward now as public, open agents of their community because, right, they feel that their arguments are grounded in reason, law, and compact.
And it speaks to
And
the
therefore,
earlier question about parallels with the Declaration of Independence.
yeah,
They also signed their names publicly and staked
right,
lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, and realized if the crown was to crack down, they got our names, right? They're
that's right,
coming out. But these are the respectable people who can speak on behalf of the whole Tidewater region, and
that's
they
right.
do, and they do place everything at hazard because they think it's already at risk, right? And they take this public stand. This is a very different mode of operations than you see with the Sons of Liberty.
That's right. Yeah. I think that has brought us to okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Betts. Thank you all for giving us your attention this evening on the 258th anniversary of the Leedstown Resolutions. Hopefully, as we approach the 260th, I mean, the 250th is coming up, and folks aren't going to be too keen on celebrating the 260th of the Leedstown Resolutions, but hopefully you'll stay with us as we work on more programming to really tease out some of the special implications of this document and the people, right, who signed it, and then, as Patrick indicated, who went on to do something else, which was to commission a portrait of one of their sort of British benefactors. And that in itself is a whole nother lecture, and an interesting one, if only because of the 31 people who signed the subscription paper for the portrait. Only 9 of them had not signed the Leedstown resolutions. The additional important feature of that is that 3 of the people who signed the subscription paper were women, and 2 of them were Lee women. One of them was a Washington. So again, thank you for paying attention. Thank you, Patrick, for helping me to think through some of the issues involved in the production of this document, the circumstances, the legacy of this document, and hopefully we're going to have opportunity to return to it in the future.
And thanks to everyone for coming, including Dr.
Yeah.
Beth, whom I admire very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, and have a good night, everyone. Good night from Stratford Hall, and good night from Milwaukee.
Good night. Bye, everyone. Bye, Gordon.
Bye-bye.